Welcome to the Moxie OT podcast, where we invite occupational therapy practitioners, consumers, and friends of OT to talk about evidence-based practice. Today we'll be talking to Rachel Bennett, who also happens to be my sister-in-law. We'll be discussing her experiences as a consumer of occupational therapy. Rachel, who plays many roles, is a pediatric RN and mother of 3. I'm honored to host her today as she shares her and her daughter Veronica's experiences of returning to breastfeeding after Veronica's open heart surgery at 3 months old. Let's meet Rachel. Today we get to have a very different conversation. We're going to talk to a consumer of occupational therapy about their experiences. We're talking with Rachel Bennett, RN, and my sister-in-law about her experiences working with her daughter Veronica in occupational therapy to return to breastfeeding. Rachel, welcome to the Moxie OT podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you here. It's really an honor to have a family member on the show, and I'm so thankful that you're willing to share your experiences with us. One value we hold very strongly in the OT community is our role as advocates. And I know you're a strong advocate in many ways, one of which is breastfeeding, and another of which is making sure your family receives the care they need. And even as we were talking about how to craft this episode, you were sure to make sure that Veronica's story, I'm going to take that again. And even as we discussed how to craft this episode, you wanted to make sure that this was as much Veronica's story as your own. Before we get into Veronica's story, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So it really is about Veronica because she was the person who received the OT. But with any sort of pediatric therapy, the parents are the ones that really are learning and having to implement. But I am a pediatric nurse. I work inpatient on a general pediatric floor in Chicago. And I am also a mother of 3. I just had my 3rd child. Veronica is our 2nd. I just had our 3rd child about a month ago.
Wow. That's a lot. You got a lot going on in your life.
Yeah.
But I just want to personally express that as I've reflected on this story that we're going to tell our podcast listeners, your personal attributes are what led to this being a success story. So I know it's Veronica's story, and I know Veronica was the recipient of occupational therapy, but your tenacity to seek out the best care for her is exactly the spirit we look to inspire in others here at Moxie OT. And I'm always impressed by your ability to get things done.
Thanks.
So way back in August of 2018, Veronica was born. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So I had my son, and that was totally healthy. Everything was great. Good breastfeeding experience. And then I had Veronica. And for my pregnancy, I was over 35 at the time. And so I had level 2 ultrasounds. And since I'm a pediatric nurse, I see a lot of really challenging, unique things. And so in my pregnancies, I've also opted to get genetic testing. And so I got that done with Veronica as well. Everything was normal. My level 2 ultrasounds were normal. Everything came back completely normal. And she was born, she was healthy. She was a fantastic breastfeeder. She was one of those babies, you see them on these like birthing documentaries where it almost looks like they climb up the torso to the breast. And she was one of those babies that just got on the breast right away. Was a great eater, had no issues. I didn't have the learning curve that I did with my son. And then about, throughout the first few weeks, and she was gaining weight with her checkups. She was gaining weight. She was doing what she was expected to do. There were no big, obvious red flags. But I did start to notice certain things. Like I felt like she was a fast breather all the time. Babies will breathe fast, and then there will be a pause, right? My husband has joked around that babies are designed to freak you out with their breathing, right? Because they stop breathing for a few seconds. And she never did that. She was always breathing fast and she was always breathing hard. She had what we call retractions, meaning sucking in, and you could see the rib cage almost constantly. I thought I saw something that we call tracheal tugging, which is where you're breathing in like that and it sucks in at the neck a lot. And there were things where I thought, this isn't normal, I thought, but I doubted myself, right? I thought, oh, I'm being too worried or whatever the case may be. And then I remember, I'll never forget, it was the weekend that we were with your family. We were celebrating your finishing your doctoral program, and she was about a month old. She was going that Monday. She was going to be going to her 1 month checkup, and I remember looking at her and thinking, I thought they were supposed to be a little bit fatter at this age. Oh well, it's only been a month,
Yeah.
that. And so I brought her to her 1 month checkup, and the pediatrician said, how's breastfeeding going? And I said, it's great. Like she eats really well. She's, I can see that she latches really well. No issues. She said, okay, because she went from the 86th percentile at birth in terms of weight and now she's at the 21st percentile. And
Wow.
well, I said, where again? Something was off, and maybe in the pounds to metric system of kilos, there was a confusion or something like that. And I was the one who said, let me weigh her, let me see that. And it still was. And then the pediatrician listened to her heart and she said, I hear a murmur. And I said, okay. Okay. And then she said, she's also breathing really fast and not not stopping.
Yeah.
And showing what we call an increased work of breathing, meaning again, the retractions, showing the ribs, breathing in, sucking in at the neck, your nostrils are flaring. And I said, okay, I had noticed that too. In fact, I had noticed it, filmed it, sent it to two friends. One is a doctor and one is another pediatric nurse. And the doctor said, don't worry about it. She looks fine, And my girlfriend, who's a nurse, she and I both said, oh man, we are just over, we were just over concerned, because as nurses, we would have said, oh, maybe we should get the medical team to look at this. But I thought, okay, I'm just being a worrywart and I need to chill out. And so with that, the doctor said, okay, I'm going to call the cardiology clinic because of this murmur. You need to go over right away. And so I did. I had my older son with me and we walked over and I was calling my husband at the time and letting him know. And she went in and got a workup and then they gave us the diagnosis. I knew something was wrong when the nurse at the cardiology clinic, at the pediatric cardiology clinic, kept popping in and saying, is your husband here yet? And
Oh
I
my
was like,
gosh.
yeah. So I knew, that
Yeah.
you don't wait for the husband to arrive if it's just like, hey, no big deal,
Yeah.
And they gave us the diagnosis. And
Which
at the
was.
time, which was something, it has many different names. It's called AV canal, AV ventricular septal defect, or but again, commonly called AV canal. And so,
Which is
and it
like a hole
essentially
in the
is a
heart.
big, yeah. So it's not, there are 4 chambers in the heart and it's one big hole in the middle of the heart. And the valves are not, all of the different valves in the heart are kind of, they come together in one spot as opposed to having their separate spots. And it's most common with children that have Down syndrome, but she has no chromosomal abnormalities or anything like that. No obvious genetic issues. And so she is an anomaly, being a typically developing child with no genetic issues, no chromosomal issues, and has this. So there's very little literature on her issue. So anyhow, they said to us that really what happens is that a baby like this will continue to grow and thrive until they're about 5 to 6 months, and at about 5 or 6 months, that's when the baby will have open heart surgery to fix it, and it's usually a one and done issue. And so the worst thing that would happen essentially would be that they would maybe have to get an NG tube, a feeding tube through their nose, in order to make sure that they're consuming calories without expending the energy to eat. So, and she was put on medication, and we went home. Um, and then after that, it was a pretty complicated story, but essentially, she wasn't thriving, she wasn't growing. Um, I was breastfeeding around the clock, and she still wasn't growing. And that led to her first of two hospitalizations.
Yeah, that was a tough road for all of us as a family, and for you and my brother in particular, obviously for Veronica. And
Yeah.
I always remember the day where I just had to drop work and go pick up her older brother from daycare, and that was kind of the start of the big hospitalization.
Yeah.
Um, and just to when I talked at the top of the podcast about your tenacity, we won't get into all the details today, but you had to really be an advocate for her in the hospital and to make sure that she got the surgery when she needed it. And um, it just I just want to make sure that our listeners understand that that's why I'm such a fan of your ability to care for your family, I guess. Um, but Veronica finally did have her surgery, and she was healing. And um, how much longer did she have to stay in the hospital after she had her surgery?
So she got very, very sick beforehand, and that again, that's unlikely, right? That's uncommon. And I do want to say that even though I was an advocate in the hospital, the care that she received was just phenomenal. So it was not me having to be an advocate because they were doing something wrong or anything like that. They were doing, I mean, the every day I just stared at them, who were my coworkers essentially. They in the PICU, she was in the pediatric ICU, and I work on a general floor. But I just stared at them with just complete awe. So the care that she received was just phenomenal. Um, but she was an anomaly in the sense that she failed. She went into really early heart failure. And at 3 months, she had to get operated on, whereas they were hoping to get to 5 or 6 months. And she had to because she was absolutely not gaining weight. They couldn't wean her off of respiratory support. Um, very rarely was she, very rarely do children with AV canals even have to be intubated, and she was intubated, which was it was the worst day of my life. Um, so she got surgery at just about a week over 3 months old, and she was in the hospital for about 2 more weeks after that, weaning, respiratory support, and then also just trying to make sure that, oh, we want to make sure she can go home eating. And she didn't. She went home on an NG. And that was really hard for me because as a mother, I think all mothers sort of feel that stress of making sure their babies are eating. And and here was this baby who, like I said, came out of the womb and within 15 minutes was on the breast eating like a champ. And then all of a sudden she was totally refusing the breast. And she had never been given a bottle, or she had been given a bottle, but always rejected a bottle prior to getting sick. And so she was not eating by any means at that point. Um, and so we took her home with an NG tube, and yeah, and it was really difficult. An NG tube and a timeline of hopefully she's eating by such and such date, otherwise she'll have to get a G tube.
That's
So
scary.
yeah, yeah,
So that
yeah,
kind of puts a lot of pressure on you as a parent, which you're trying to not put on Veronica to
right,
get back to oral feeding.
right.
Um, so finding the appropriate therapy to address feeding is difficult. you're given such and such choices, and this is covered by insurance and this isn't covered. What were some
Right.
of the options provided to you?
Yeah. Um, so first of all, very fortunately at the time we lived in Illinois, right? We were in Chicago. We lived in Illinois, and in Illinois, something called early intervention is a right for all children. That's not the case in every state, unfortunately. So in my from my perspective, we were really, really fortunate because had we just had essentially the right for her to get help, right? As opposed to other
Yeah.
places where you don't necessarily have that right. And that should be something that everybody has. And unfortunately, that's not the case. So we And then we were also in Chicago, so it's almost like there are so many choices that you don't even know where to begin. And she was also a very specific, unique case because she was breastfeeding. All of a sudden, she's rejecting the breast. And that was something I was worried about in the hospital with her intubation and everything like that. I don't want her to become orally averse, meaning that um, she's scared to have anything put in her mouth when she has this trauma of like, there's this tube in my mouth and people are coming and suctioning out my mouth, and all of a sudden my mouth becomes this dangerous space, so to speak,
Right.
right? And so I'd done a lot of reading about that. And I had just asked while she was in the hospital, I asked like the respiratory therapists and nurses if they could please just pause before she has to be suctioned and tell her, even though she's like 2 or 3 months old, right? Just so that way, I don't know. I just didn't want her to become orally averse, and then she did. And so initially, she saw speech therapy, which is normal and typical to do. But I knew that in the medical world, we're so volume focused,
Yeah.
meaning how much are you consuming, especially for children. I mean, that's it's obsessive, right? And with reason. You don't I mean, dehydration is a is a really, if an adult becomes dehydrated, it's one thing. If a baby, a 3 month old does, it's another thing.
Yeah.
So so I looked up and found in the Chicago area a speech pathologist who is also a lactation consultant. And I called her as we were leaving the hospital from the car and
Which
made
I just so our listeners know that is very Rachel.
it.
typical typical action on your part.
Well, and so I called, and she was discharged on a Thursday, and I think we were there by Saturday or maybe Sunday. But then Sarah, had also suggested an OT who did feeding therapy. And that'll circle back later in the story. And I reached out to her as well. And she called me and she told me, if I were on this timeline of, trying to prevent a G tube,
Hmm.
I would do, X, Y, and Z. But she specifically said, I haven't worked with breastfeeding moms doing this. Like her focus was more on kids with G tubes. So she said, I think it's best if you go with the speech pathologist who is also a lactation consultant. And so we did, and we had just really helpful multiple sessions in which we worked on ways to respect Veronica's mouth, so to
Right,
speak.
right. Yeah.
But then also get her to start introducing the bottle because, again, volume focused, needed to get this skinny little baby fed.
Yeah. She's always been a little one since
Yeah, I mean, except at
since
birth,
that first.
right?
Right. She was
So,
your biggest baby, but
yeah, my biggest baby, but then my littlest. Yeah,
yeah, so I think I've obviously been researching breastfeeding and feeding therapies since we started talking about doing this podcast. And there's definitely sort of this push pull between that volume feeding and then that um, how do we get kiddos to feel more comfortable with the feeding process if we're just
right,
sort of pushing, pushing, pushing.
right.
So, but with the SLP, she did return to oral feeding, right? Am I remembering that
Yeah.
right?
Yep, exactly. And so with the speech pathologist, we and lactation consultant that we were working with, and we were fortunate because my insurance, we could see her not as a speech pathologist, but actually as a lactation
Oh,
consultant.
that's very interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, so that was fantastic.
And I can
Um,
remember this picture. We were all sitting at the table, and she was just like eating yogurt and getting it all over herself. And that was like when I was like, okay, she's eating. Like,
right. And that was quite a bit after, or maybe a few months after, right? It seems so
yeah.
long at the time. But yeah, so she got back to eating in terms of like bottle feeding at that point. And at that point, she was just under 4 months. So solids were not even, um, solids were not
It was just bottle
like
feeding at that
literally on
time.
the table. Or
Yeah,
so
she was
she was
still
not.
so tiny. She was
Yeah,
still a
right,
baby.
right. And so we
Uh,
started feeding with a bottle, and we're talking small amounts, 7 mLs, right? Which
wow.
yeah, I'm sure your listeners know what mLs are, but like some like
She even
the
had
tiniest
teeny
amount.
tiny bottles, didn't she?
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And eventually the NG came out about a month and a half, a month and a week or so after surgery. And when it fell out, we were lucky to have a cardiologist who was not as volume driven. And that was something that later we realized that her cardiologist is just wonderful. And he also, I mean, when I would tell the speech language pathologist slash lactation consultant that he wasn't as volume driven, she was shocked and really pleased. And then later when I told her OT feeding therapist this, they were just so like, let me get his number so I
Yeah.
can refer others to him. But anyway, so not as volume driven. And it was more like, let's look at the overall picture and the overall progress, even if that progress is super slow.
That's great.
So first we worked with speech. I went to, and then again, my insurance only had a few visits, and then I had to go through a different route of going to a speech pathologist through my insurance. That wasn't a lactation consultant, and then I went to four. I brought her to four different speech pathologists. She saw
Wow.
one hospital, and then three outside of the hospital. One was the lactation consultant, the other one was through early intervention, and then another one was at the hospital I work at to see who are all feeding therapists. And they all said, she looks like she's eating all right. She
Yeah.
just, for whatever reason, we don't know why, she just won't take more than an ounce at a time, is what was happening. Um, and so after that, I was so concerned about getting her back to breast. I wanted her off of the bottle and back on breast.
And can you
And
tell us about why that was important to you?
yeah, so it's funny because I became obsessive about it. Um, which I don't necessarily think was healthy, but I joke around it was because I was lazy, because it's so much easier to pop a baby on the breast
Sure.
than prepare a bottle, pump, wash the bottle, clean out the pump parts, do this, do that. I mean, that's like so much more work. And even formula, sitting there mixing it, trying to figure out the amount, and then it can't be out for longer than this and that. It's just it. I joked around it was because I was lazy, but in some ways, honestly, it was also about me as well. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not sure, because my other joke was I am addicted to the oxytocin high, right?
Yeah.
That I felt such a connection with her and with my firstborn, and then now this baby with the breastfeeding, and I just felt, I don't know, there was just something that I was like, this would be easier. This would be better, easier for them. It would be healthier from, an immunity perspective, all these other things. But ultimately, I'm not going to lie, it came down to that's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Um,
That's the kind of parent you are. That's
well,
where you connect with your child. You
right.
know, the OT literature on breastfeeding is really about how it's a co-occupation. This is a time
Mhm.
for nurturing your child. This is where, you know, you and your child bond and create a connection. And, you know, it was valuable to you.
It was. But I do remember thinking, like, this baby, unlike my oldest, this baby, I mean, she came out and like looked you straight in the eyes. Like she owned you, Oh, she owned me when she came out. And she, I felt, and no one should ever go into become a parent because they want to feel loved, right? Because that's certainly not how it works. But I felt loved by her. And I remember thinking, she loved me even with the bottle feeding. What am I trying to do when I was trying to sort of
Mhm.
like bring myself out of the quest to get her back to breast? But there's just something about it that I needed and wanted. Um, and so I brought her to an osteopathic doctor because I had learned about different like spinal healing that they would do. I brought her to a chiropractor consultation, and didn't go through with it because it was going to cost thousands of dollars and there was no guarantee that she would get back to breast. I explored craniosacral therapy, right? I mean, you get when you're trying to get your kid to eat, because it was dual. It wasn't just getting back to breast. It was also
Right.
trying to get this baby. Like I think in that time period, the most she would eat on a typical day would be an ounce and a half at a time, right? And at 5, 6 months, that's not normal. But generally speaking, it was a half an ounce to an ounce. And her weight gain was so slow. And there was all this promise of, oh, after she gets her surgery, she's just gonna fatten up, But
Right.
here you are. I mean, I was dealing with this baby that was so skinny. And we got out of the needing a G tube zone, again, because her cardiologist was fantastic at just like, okay, well, this is maybe who she is. But I still felt like there had to be something more.
Yeah.
And so I don't know when it was, but at one point I went back to the OT that I consulted with initially, who was a feeding therapist, and reached out to her. Um, and I was able to get her to come as a consult through Illinois' early intervention program and have her like have the billing go through that. And she is who we worked with in order to get her eventually back to breast. And not only, well, I'll get into that in a second, that bit.
Okay. Yeah, cause that OT, I guess we'll just go ahead and say her name. She's Karen Dilfer,
Mm-hmm.
and she uses a child-centered, hunger-based approach, and you know, again, it's different than the behavioral approach or the volume-based approach that is often used when a child has an oral aversion. And sometimes it sounds pretty terrible when you say a hunger-based approach, but it's a lot more about normalizing food and food experience and creating those positive experiences for the child. So, can you tell us a little bit more about what were some of your experiences working with Karen?
Yeah. So again, she told me, I mean, and again, I don't want to misquote her. I don't know if she would say hunger based, but that's my understanding of how it was. And everywhere you hear when with baby is like, don't offer them anything. When I would try to get her on a bottle, they say, don't try and, say bottle or bust, because then they'll just hate the bottle or whatever the case may be.
Yeah,
And they would, I don't think OTs that use this approach or these sorts of approaches would see it as like starvation or anything like that. But
sure.
I had actually read about it, about these approaches in an article in the New York Times about a family who had a cardiac baby. Um, again, they didn't know until after birth, and who eventually did wind up on a G tube with an oral aversion, and getting that baby off of the G tube, or getting that then toddler preschooler off of the G tube. And so I met with Karen. I think Veronica was probably 6 or 7 months at the time, 6 or 7 months old. And I had been told by others, including people who are huge breastfeeding advocates, it's very unlikely that a baby this old is going to get back to breast. So and I appreciate that they said that, because you want to manage expectations, right? But I didn't want to believe it. My husband even was like, your brother was just like, I remember him just being like, you know, she's not going to get back, Rachel, like. So anyway, I met with Karen, and Karen couldn't, she couldn't promise that, right? She just said we could just try and see what happens.
Yeah.
And the approach is really about creating a few positive experiences, neutral and then positive, right? And then building up on that and not pushing it, right? It's like when we go to like let's say like a buffet or whatever, you go to a buffet and you're like, at first it's like, this is a positive experience, I want to keep doing it until you're like, oh my God, why did I do that? And so that's not it. You want to really end it with the children. You want to end it on a positive experience. Like, oh, you had a positive experience, we'll stop now, and then we'll have another positive experience later, that kind of thing. But really, it had to start off as a neutral one. I had, so it's so hard because you want to just like, shove their face onto the bottle or shove their face onto the nipple and make them eat. But then that creates more resistance, right? So this was more about sitting Veronica on my lap with my shirt off and my breasts completely exposed, in winter, in Chicago winter, turning up the heat, and just being, just as if they weren't even there, right? And just being, and playing or reading to her, and then eventually sort of like getting her, bringing the book closer to your breast, having a toy right next to your breast, seeing it as a positive thing. And eventually it built up to, doing that multiple times a day, maybe like 2 or 3 times a day for about 10 to 15 minutes. And if there's any resistance, immediately end that session with no big deal, with no,
Which is so hard, I think, when you're very excited to get started
right.
with this, and maybe you thought of a fun thing we were going to do today. And
Right, exactly. And so once you do that, you build up. And I remember, I'm pushing for, like, with Karen, I'd say, how many, how often and how many,
yeah,
and when are we moving to the next thing? And she was just like, she said, I don't know, like, she was like, I don't know, let's have 75% of those experiences be positive for her.
mm-hmm.
And then after that, put a little, just express a little bit of milk from your breast. Let her see it. Whereas I'm expressing and shoving her face onto it, right? Like, come on and eat, and she's like, no. And so not doing that, and instead just expressing and seeing it, right? And so with kids that are being maybe weaned from a G tube, it might be a case where you just have the food on the table and there's no shoving it in your mouth, that kind of thing, right? So, and then eventually taking, once you have several times where I just express milk and Veronica notices it, then I'm taking the milk on my finger and just holding it up towards her, or offering it and letting her come to you. So that's the other thing too. I think they really use it. It's like this ask permission approach.
Right.
So offering
I think
it,
that's
not
the
shoving
name
it.
of their approach.
Exactly. Yeah. And then after that, seeing if she'll put her mouth on it, seeing if she'll then lick it, and then bringing your finger closer to the breast. And we got to the point where Veronica was even putting her mouth onto my nipple and kind of exploring it with her mouth and looking at me and then coming off. And, and here I am having to do poker face, but I mean, poker face with like a little bit of like,
The
oh, that's
positive.
nice. Yeah, positive, but not, not have that act of desperation that I had been doing for months. And the plan was eventually to do a 36-hour trial in which, at the time Veronica was getting solids, in which she was having fruit or having, something like that, but to not offer the bottle at all and to just see what happens when nothing but the breast is there. I think I have
Is
that
she
could be
there?
that could be edited out. No, I don't know. Johnny came up, but I think it might
Okay.
be the diaper change for Thomas. Um, and so that was the plan. And there's a lot of nervousness around that because of dehydration. You're already dealing with an underweight baby. Do you want a 36-hour period in which they aren't going to be eating really?
Hmm.
So,
So was
uh,
that a little uncomfortable then to?
yeah. So, I was really nervous because I didn't want her pediatrician. I didn't want her cardiologist. I didn't want because things are so volume based.
Yeah.
I was afraid that I was doing something that would put her in peril, and I didn't want them, essentially being like, "You made the wrong decision."
Yeah,
You
I
know,
think
I, I
something
didn't.
that well, something that you and I have talked about a little bit in the past is the judgments that are put on parents and mothers, and especially breastfeeding mothers.
Right. Yeah. Right. Essentially, yeah. And then, I mean, how can somebody not listen to this and think, oh, well, she wanted to do this for herself, And it's sort of like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
yeah, I did, and that's kind of okay too, like, or is it? I don't know. I think so. But it
from
was
everything that I've read, that bonding experience is very important, and
yeah.
yeah, I think it's fair.
Well, I also was worried about, and again, like with my experience as a pediatric nurse, I was worried that I was going to be showing up to the ER with my dehydrated baby and
Yeah.
she was going to have to be admitted and, like she was going to be dehydrated and I was going to be in trouble. There's all that fear too, right? So, um, but Karen said, dehydration with a 6-month-old when they're still going to be offered, she was still going to be offered purees, right? She's still going to be getting fluids, right?
Right.
And making sure that she's like really amped up the day before with like, she's well fed the day before and leading up to it. And my understanding is that with the approach, and they would somebody an OT that practices this would know it better than me. They're willing to see a decrease. I think maybe up to 10% or something like that in calorie decrease or weight decrease or something like that. But you know, I remember talking to another lactation consultant who was also a nurse, and she said, "Give it a try," and I don't think a pediatrician would ever say, "Oh, give it a try." Like that would be too crazy. That would be too dangerous, right? And but then we didn't even have to get there because it kind of happened organically.
Wow.
And what happened was we were at your house on Easter. She was almost 8 months old, and that whole day she did not want to take from the bottle, hardly ate at all, but from the bottle. And I can't remember in terms of solids. And, I think we were planning that maybe later that week we would do this. We would do this experiment of the 36-hour bit. And, but anyway, that day she didn't really have anything. Of course, I was worried. Oh my gosh, no fluids this whole day. She's going to be dehydrated. What do I do? And that night, uncharacteristically, she was fussy. She's never really been a fussy baby until her younger brother just came along now. And now she's very fussy. She's like, no, 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 this is not okay. But that day, so at 8 months old, that night, she was really fussy before bed. And that was so odd. And she wouldn't take the bottle, which, wasn't uncommon. She wouldn't take the bottle, or she would refuse it, or she'd only have half an ounce or an ounce. That wasn't uncommon in those days. And for whatever reason, I picked her up out of her crib at bedtime, and I just held her, just like kind of rocking her, which was not something I normally had to do. And I don't know what made me decide, but I was holding her like cradle hold. And what made me decide to just sort of like lift my shirt up and, pull my bra down and bring out my breast and just have her there as I held her. Right. And so
Uh-huh.
she was right there. She was right there, and just holding her and rocking her. And then all of a sudden, I felt her lips on my breast, and I thought, okay, and you're sitting there, you're trying not to force it, like, put it on. And then she did. She pulled my nipple into her mouth, and I was shocked. And I just sat there, in the darkness, wondering what's happening. And she started she latched, and she started to suck. And I had not stage fright. What is it? I might have to redo this part, Brian. But I had, what is it when, okay, this is definitely going to be redone. What is it when a man can't perform? Performance anxiety. There we go. And she brought, okay, redo. She
Can we
brought my,
go? Can we go back then? Like,
yeah, to what part?
just when I had stage fright,
Yeah, or performance anxiety.
performance
Yeah.
anxiety. Okay.
Yeah.
Just a moment. Back in 5 seconds.
Okay. And I had performance anxiety. I couldn't, my breast didn't let down, my milk didn't let down. I couldn't. I was too excited.
Oh no.
Yeah, but who knows if she got out a little bit. But anyway, so it was a positive experience. And I let her just stay there. And then finally she sort of like calmed down. I put her back into bed, and it was Easter, and I texted Karen and I said, I don't know what to do, and
This isn't part of the plan.
and I know. And she called me and she said, this is great. This is like, it's like we're doing this organically, and
Yeah.
I said, what do I do? And she said, give it another try. Do it again. And then we eventually decided to do that. And she went back on. And then we decided to have Veronica, to essentially start the experiment then, and have Veronica come into bed with me that night. And that would be the only thing. I would only offer breast that night, because she wasn't normally eating overnight anyway at that point. And I did. And there were, we had Johnny go into the guest bedroom so he didn't have to like hear crying all night. And there were times where she just like was crying, and I would just be there with her, not forcing. And finally she did. And then we never went back. So that was
Wow.
and in the first week, so this is where, okay, it's not just about me and what I want. It's about what was good for Veronica. For whatever reason, I don't know if because breastfeeding was such an enjoyable experience for her again, but for whatever reason, in that first week, she grew more than she had since the surgery.
That's incredible.
And the first month, she made it out of the negative percentile for weight and got into,
Yeah.
like 2 or 3 or 4th percentile, right? But when you're negative, like that's a great thing. And she started gaining weight, and we were not supplementing with bottles at all, except for on days that I worked. And I wasn't pumping except for on days that I worked. And she finally went up in weight.
That's incredible. I think, I mean, and I remember we talked about that so much at that time. Like, is it that the breast milk is more healthy, or is it that, the experience, and we'll never know.
Right. I think, you know, her speech pathologist slash breast consultant said something like, I wonder if she were to get on, if she would take even more volume because it's a more of a positive experience just
Yeah,
sitting there, you know.
absolutely.
But, you know, here we were giving her bottles with, you know, essentially where she didn't even have to work because we were so desperate for her to get volume. So we thought, oh, volume is what we needed. And maybe she ended up getting more. I mean, she had to have gotten more volume at
Right.
the breast directly for her to gain weight, I'm assuming.
Right.
So,
Well, and we know now how much Veronica really appreciates breastfeeding. So, it has been a nurturing and bonding experience for her too.
right,
So,
right. Yeah, yeah.
how's Veronica doing now?
She's fine. Do you want to pause and have her come on?
I would love that.
Okay. So let me see. So we'll pause and I'll go get
Yeah,
her,
that's fine.
that kind of thing. And then I'll,
Yeah. Okay.
hey, Johnny. Oh, I hear womb sounds happening. So I'm sure Thomas is like, let me go get her. Veronica. Wonder if you'll have to edit this to make it just a little shorter. They went to the store, Johnny
Oh,
and Veronica. If you want, we can do another thing
yeah.
later where she comes on.
Okay.
But so Adrian's outside shoveling in the front yard.
Great.
Where's Daddy and Veronica? He's like, oh, they went to the store.
All right. Well, we'll just do the quick wrap up and then
Okay.
we can always get on a little later if we need to.
Okay.
All right. So at the Moxie OT podcast, we always want to make sure we provide an opportunity for our listeners to increase their Moxie. So if another mother was struggling with breastfeeding, what resources would you recommend?
Oh my goodness. Well, obviously I would look if it were a case of back to breast, I would explore the option that I just talked about. There, I don't normally recommend anything on Facebook because I think that that's just a very difficult place to navigate. But there was a really helpful group that I found on Facebook called Back to Breast. Um, if it's just general struggles, lactation consultants can be incredibly helpful. And I think in general, a lot of hospitals have them. A lot of insurance will accept it.
I think that I don't know if it's a national mandate. I think it might be that they have to have a lactation consultant. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Hospitals.
Yes.
But it's so hard because obviously when the baby's born, you're just in a fog afterwards.
Right.
So,
Right.
and then there's so many community support resources like La Leche League and lots of breastfeeding groups, you know. So I think in the age of COVID, I think a lot of it has to go online. But I think getting somebody in person, and if it doesn't work, find somebody else. Not in terms of that person's not doing it, but in terms of just getting different perspectives. It's group, you know, this kind of like having different thoughts, different experiences, different perspectives can be very helpful.
Yeah, I think that that's a good lesson learned from yours and Veronica's stories. Like lots of people contributed little pieces to this puzzle.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. There wasn't one, you know, savior. There wasn't one thing that absolutely worked. And who knows, maybe Karen, when I spoke to her, you know, pretty much I think it was the day after we got home on the phone, maybe at that point it wouldn't have worked. I don't know, right? It was kind of
Right.
this like constellation of different people and different ideas and different places where Veronica was.
Absolutely. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really inspiring and hopeful conversation, and I appreciate having you here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this important conversation with Rachel about her experiences participating in occupational therapy. One reason I invited Rachel on the show today was because of how important I feel it is for OT to recognize our role in breastfeeding promotion. Petoniak's article in AJOT reminds us that breastfeeding is an important, complex co-occupation that serves as an opportunity for bonding and attachment for the mother and child. As OTs who seek to support health and wellness, breastfeeding is an important co-occupation to address. The New York Times article Rachel referred to was When Your Baby Won't Eat, and describes the family's experience returning to eating after their child underwent cardiac surgery and was living with a feeding tube. La Leche League is a worldwide organization whose mission is to provide mother-to-mother breastfeeding support and education. Rachel discussed working with Karen Dilfer, who uses the Get Permission feeding approach. Their organization offers a host of resources, including CEU opportunities. We'll have links to all of these resources on our website. If you want to be a part of the conversation, leave us your email address at moxieot.com. We're on all of your favorite social media channels as well. The Moxie OT podcast was recorded in our home in the Avondale neighborhood of Chicago. This episode was produced by Brian Zira. Our intro music is courtesy of 13 Tacos Studio. Technical assistance was provided by our dog Grody. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.